I called my mom excitedly after getting promoted with an $8 million salary. She paused, then said, "Tell your girlfriend you were fired." I obeyed. What happened the next morning showed me how smart my mother really was. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. That Tuesday morning, I was sitting in the waiting room on the 34th floor, the same floor where I'd worked for 11 years, the same building I'd arrived at 7 in the morning for 11 years, the same place where I'd sacrificed weekends, nights, vacations I never took, birthdays I saw pass by from a computer screen. 11 years. I sat in that chair with my hands clasped over my knees, looking at the cold marble floor and thought, what do they call me for this time? Because in an 11-year career, you learn to read the signs. And when they call you like this, suddenly, on a Tuesday without context, without a visible agenda, without any explanation, your stomach does things that reason can't control. My name is Jeremias. I'm 42 years old, and that morning I didn't know my life was about to split into two parts, what I was before that Tuesday and what I'd become after. I joined that company when I was 31, young, ambitious, with a folder of projects under my arm and the naivety of someone who believes that effort is always enough. Back then, the CEO was a man named Ildefonso, who welcomed me into his office with a cup of black coffee and a single question: why should I hire you and not the other 12 candidates I've got waiting outside? I answered without hesitating, because the other 12 want the job. I want the problem you need to solve. Ildefonso smiled. I was hired that same day. For 11 years, I worked as if every day was a test. I arrived before anyone else and left after everyone. I learned every area of the company. I got into projects nobody wanted to touch because they were difficult, because they were risky, because they had more chances of failing than succeeding. And precisely for that reason I chose them, because I always believe character isn't formed in easy moments. There were good years. There were years where I felt the ground moving beneath my feet. There was a crisis in 2019 that almost led us to bankruptcy, and I remember spending 72 hours without sleep working on a proposal that would save 3 international contracts. We saved them. Nobody said thank you to me formally, but Ildefonso looked at me from the other side of the meeting room and nodded slowly with that way of his of acknowledging without words. That was enough for me. But that Tuesday morning, sitting in that waiting chair, I wasn't thinking about all that. I was thinking about Lilia. Lilia and I had been together for 3 years. 3 years that had been in many ways the most stable of my adult life. She was smart, self-confident. She knew exactly what she wanted and how to ask for it. We had conversations about the future, about a house, about a trip to Europe we kept postponing, about the increasingly concrete possibility of formalizing our relationship. I loved her, or at least I thought so, and it was thinking of her that I heard my name. I looked up. Margarita, Ildefonso's executive assistant, was standing in front of me with an expression I couldn't read at that moment. It wasn't worry, it wasn't pity, it was something more like containment, like someone who knows something big and is making an effort not to show it ahead of time. Mr. Ildefonso is expecting you. I got up, adjusted my jacket, took a breath and walked toward that door, not knowing that on the other side the news that would split my life in two was waiting for me. Ildefonso's office had always seemed big to me, but that morning it felt different, quieter, heavier. He was standing in front of the large window, looking at the city with his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn around immediately. He let me come in, hear the click of the door closing, and stand in the middle of the room for a few seconds that felt much longer than they were. Then he turned and looked at me in a way he hadn't ever looked at me before, with something I took a while to identify, but that I later recognized perfectly. It was pride. "Sit down, Jeremias." I sat down, and he, without beating around the bush, without preambles, without the kind of introduction people use when they're going to say something difficult, told me, "I want you to be the new CEO of this company with a salary of $8 million a year, and I want you to start next Monday." The world stopped. I felt something in my chest I don't know how to describe accurately. It wasn't just joy. It was 11 years of early mornings, of silent resignations, of moments where I doubted myself and kept going anyway, turning into something concrete, into something real, into something worthwhile. I left that building, and the first thing I did was dial my mother's number. My mother answered on the second ring. She always answers on the second ring. I don't know if it's a habit or if somehow she always knows I'm going to call, but in 42 years of life, she has never let the phone ring more than twice when I'm the one calling. Jeremias. She just said my name. And in that name, there was something, an unasked question, a wait. Mom, I told her, and my voice broke before I could finish the sentence. They offer me the CEO position, $8 million a year. Ildefonso chose me. There was a silence, not the awkward silence of someone who doesn't know what to say. It was the silence of someone who's processing something with much more care than the situation apparently demands. My mother has always been like that. While everyone reacts, she thinks. While everyone talks, she observes. She's a woman who has lived enough to know that the most important things aren't answered in a hurry. And how do you feel? She asked me happily. I told her scared but happy. Another shorter silence this time. Jeremias, I need you to do something, and I need you to do it tonight without questioning me. Something in her tone stopped me. It wasn't urgency. It wasn't fear. It was that calm certainty that people who have seen more than one imagines have. The voice of someone who doesn't speak from intuition, but from knowledge. Tell me, I answered, call Lilia. Tell her you got fired. I stood motionless in the middle of the sidewalk. People passed around me, hurried, indifferent, and I was standing there as if the ground had solidified beneath my feet. What? I need you to call her tonight and tell her you got fired, that the company decided to let you go without severance, without explanations, that you're out of a job. Mom, that doesn't make any sense. I've just received the best news of my life. Why am I going to call her to tell her the opposite? Because I need you to see something. See what? She didn't answer immediately. And when she did, her voice had that specific weight it only acquires when she says something she isn't willing to repeat. If you have to explain to someone why they should stay with you when you don't have anything anymore, then you already have the answer you need. Do it, Jeremias, and tell me tomorrow. She hung up. I was left with the phone in my hand in the middle of the street with $8 million of annual salary in my pocket and an instruction I didn't fully understand, but that weighed on me as if it were made of stone. I walked to my car, sat down, put my hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine, and sat there quietly for maybe 20 minutes looking at the windshield without seeing anything. I thought about Lilia, about the 3 years we'd been together, about the conversations about the future, about the house, about that trip to Europe that always found a reason to be postponed. I thought about the way she talked about me with her friends, with that tone of almost possessive pride I'd always interpreted as love. I thought about all the times she'd told me she admired me, that I was the hardest working man she'd ever met, that with someone like me by her side, she didn't have anything to worry about. And in that moment, sitting in that car, I started asking myself something I'd never asked myself with such clarity before. Does she admire me, or does she admire what I represent? I dialed her number. Jeremias, it's good you're calling. I was thinking about you. How was your day? Her voice was warm, natural, her usual voice. I closed my eyes, took a breath. Lilia, I have to tell you something. Today they called me to Ildefonso's office. I paused. I got fired. Silence. A different silence from my mother's. My mother's silence was that of someone who thinks. Lilia's was that of someone who recalibrates. What? I got fired. They said they're going to restructure management, that they're doing away with my position, without clear severance. They're still reviewing the terms. I'm on a job, Lilia. Another longer silence. Well, she finally said, and in that word there was something I didn't want to analyze yet. These things happen. I guess you'll find something. Nothing more, without asking how I felt, without saying she'd be by my side, without the natural instinct of someone who loves someone and hears them say they've just lost 11 years of their career in one blow. Just these things happen. Are you okay? I asked her almost by instinct. Yes, I'm fine. Listen, I'll call you tomorrow. Yes, I'm at Georgina's house, and we're about to have dinner. And she hung up. I was left with the phone in my hand for the second time that night. But this time it was different. The first time I didn't understand what my mother was asking me to do. Now I was beginning to understand all too well what she was preparing me for. I didn't sleep well that night. I moved between sleep and waking up like someone who can't let go of something weighing on their chest. At 3 in the morning, I got up to drink water and stood in the kitchen in the dark thinking about that silence of Lilia's, analyzing it, looking for a different explanation than the one that came to me alone, automatically, every time I remembered it. These things happen. 3 words. That was it. 3 words for 11 years of my life. The next morning I woke up early. It was 6:47 when I looked at the phone and there wasn't a single message from her. No, how are you? No. I stayed up all night thinking about you. Nothing. The screen was empty with the same indifference with which she'd hung up the night before. I called my mother at 8 in the morning. She answered on the second ring and asked me just that, as if she'd been waiting for that call since she closed her eyes the night before. I told her everything. The silence, the 3 words, the phone with no messages. I'll call you tomorrow, said with the same lightness with which one says goodbye to an acquaintance on the street. My mother listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't say, "I knew it." She didn't do any of the things people do when they're right and want you to acknowledge it. She just said, "Jeremias, a woman who loves you doesn't hang up the phone when you lose your job. A woman who loves you asks how you feel, and if you cry, she stays awake thinking about how to help you." What you heard last night wasn't a reaction from someone who loves you. It was the reaction of someone who was evaluating if you were still convenient for her. The words fell slowly, one by one, like stones in still water. "And now what do I do?" I asked her. Now, my mother said, "You're going to that job on Monday, and you're going to be the best CEO that company has ever had." Because what Lilia doesn't know yet is that you didn't lose anything. She did. I hung up. I sat on the edge of the bed with my elbows on my knees and my gaze fixed on the floor. There was something strange in what I felt at that moment. It wasn't just pain. It was a mixture of things that don't have a single name. There was the blow of understanding that the person you imagined your future with was calculating her exit while you thought you were building something together. But there was also something else, something like an uncomfortable but necessary clarity. The feeling of someone who finally sees something that had been right in front of their eyes for a long time without wanting to look at it directly. That morning, as the sun came through the window and the city began to move outside, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fall apart. I wasn't going to call her to explain myself, to beg, to seek a conversation that would fix everything, because there are things that can't be fixed. There are things you simply see, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. What Lilia had shown in those few hours wasn't a specific mistake or an impulsive reaction. It was who she was. And what my mother had done with that simple instruction wasn't a game or a capricious test. It was an act of love, the kind of love that doesn't tell you what you want to hear, but what you need to know. I got up, took a shower, put on my clothes more calmly than I expected to feel, and as I looked at myself in the mirror, I thought about Ildefonso, about the approaching Monday, about the $8 million that represented 11 years of right decisions made in silence. My mother was right. I hadn't lost anything. The loss, although she didn't know it yet, was hers. Sunday night, I didn't sleep well. Not out of sadness, not because of Lilia, but because of something different, something harder to describe because it doesn't have the drama of pain or the clarity of joy. It was a mix of anticipation and weight. The feeling of someone who knows tomorrow everything changes and can't turn their brain off even if their body needs it. I got up at 5:30 in the morning, an hour earlier than necessary. I made myself a coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the mug between my hands, and stared out the dark window while the city still slept. I thought about the previous 11 years, about all the mornings I'd arrived at that building as an employee, as someone who executes, who proposes, who delivers. And I thought about what it meant to arrive that Monday as something different, as the person who decides, the person who signs, the person whom hundreds of other people depend on, who also get up early, who also have families, who also need someone at the helm to make the right decisions. That weighed on me, and it was right that it weighed. I arrived at the building at 7:10 in the morning, 10 minutes later than I always arrive, because I wanted to break, even in that small detail, the inertia of the employee I was for 11 years. The glass doors opened. The security guard greeted me with a nod of the head different from his usual one, more formal, more aware, and I walked toward the elevators, feeling something strange in my feet, as if the floor had a different texture, even though it was the same marble as always. Margarita was already at her desk. When I reached the 34th floor, she had a folder ready, a printed agenda, and a cup of coffee she'd placed on the desk that was now mine. She looked at me with that expression of hers of contained efficiency and said, "Good morning, Mr. Jeremias. You have 3 meetings before noon." I summarized the critical points of each one in the folder for you. I thanked her. I entered the office, closed the door slowly, and stood in the center of that room that until 4 days ago had belonged to Ildefonso, looking at the large window, the city spread out outside, the same buildings I'd seen from other windows for 11 years. But that from here had a completely different perspective. I sat in the chair, opened the folder, and started working. The first meeting was at 8 in the morning. I entered the room, and there were 7 people sitting around the table. I knew them all. I worked with most of them for years, but that day they looked at me differently, some with genuine respect. I recognized that because it's a look you can't fake well. Others with that calculated neutrality of someone who's still evaluating, measuring, deciding if the new CEO deserves loyalty or if it's better to wait and see how he moves before betting. And there was one, Victor, who looked at me with something that wasn't either of the previous 2 things. Victor had been with the company for 8 years. He was smart, presentable, and knew exactly how to navigate the spaces where decisions are made. He'd always had that specific ability to appear close to power without ever fully committing to anyone. I'd observed him for years. I knew what he was. And that morning, sitting across from me on the other side of the table, with his arms crossed and a smile too calm for the situation, I knew Victor was going to be an issue. I opened the meeting. I was direct. I told them I wasn't going to waste time on welcoming speeches or vague promises about the future of the company. I told them I'd observed them for 11 years, that I knew what each one was capable of doing, and that my expectation was simple. Concrete results, honest communication, and no hidden agendas. I told them my office door was open for anyone who had something to say to my face, but that I had no patience or time for hallway conversations that reached my ear third hand. There was a silence, one of those silences where people process not just what you said, but how you said it. Then one by one, they started nodding. Victor didn't nod, he smiled. And that difference, so small, almost imperceptible, told me everything I needed to know. The second meeting was more technical. Numbers, projections, a contract with an international client that was at a delicate point and needed a decision before Thursday. They presented me with 3 options. I listened to them all. I asked questions that made some uncomfortable because they were questions that showed I already knew the answers and was verifying if they knew them too. In the end, I made a decision that wasn't any of the 3 options presented, but a combination of elements from all 3 that nobody had considered putting together. Margarita, who was taking notes in the corner, looked up for a second and looked at me with something that looked a lot like surprise. I like that. The third meeting was the hardest, not because of the topics, but because of what it represented. It was with the team Ildefonso had built most directly, the people who had worked with him for decades, and who now had someone new sitting in his place right in front of them. I walked in, and the atmosphere was different from the other meetings, tenser, more loaded with history. There was a man named Lazaro who'd been with the company for 19 years, and who looked at me from the first moment with an expression that wasn't hostile, but it was a test. It was the look of someone saying, without words, "Show me you deserve to be here." They told me indirectly, with very specific technical questions, with references to past decisions they assumed I didn't know, with that veiled language people use when they want to measure someone without seeming to measure them. And I answered everything calmly, without the need to prove anything aggressively, without raising my voice, without that impulse of someone who feels they have to earn respect by throwing punches. I simply answered with data, with context, with a memory of 11 years that nobody in that room had more complete than me. At the end of that meeting, Lazaro stood up, extended his hand, and told me with a seriousness that was worth more than any applause, "Welcome, CEO." And something in the air of that room changed. I came out of the meetings at noon with a full head and a body running on that specific adrenaline of days where everything matters. I sat in my office, looked at the city from the large window, and allowed myself, for the first time since Sunday, not to think about Lilia, but she thought about me. At 1:17 in the afternoon, I got a message. I saw it on the phone screen without picking it up yet, as if I needed a second before opening it. It said, "Hey, how are you? It got late yesterday, and I didn't call you. Do you have plans this week?" Without mentioning the job, without asking how I felt about the company thing, without any reference to the fact that, according to what I'd told her, I'd lost my job after 11 years. Just, "Do you have plans this week?" I read it twice, put it in my pocket, and didn't answer because there are things that don't need an answer. There are moments when silence isn't cowardice or indifference. It's simply the only honest answer that exists. And I'd learned that from my mother, who spent her whole life saying more with what she keeps quiet than with what she says. That afternoon, while I was reviewing the previous quarter's reports with a concentration I hadn't felt in a long time, I received a call from Ildefonso. He was calling me from his retirement, with that calm voice of someone who has finally let go of the weight they carried for years. "How was the first day?" he asked me. "Good," I told him, difficult in the right places. He laughed. A short, genuine laugh. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. "Jeremias, one thing. Victor is going to make a move. You know him. I'm just telling you to watch him." I already watched him. I answered. Another silence of the kind where things are meant. "Yes," Ildefonso said. "I knew you would." He hung up, and I stared at the phone for a moment, thinking about everything that man had seen for years without telling me, waiting for the moment when I could see it for myself. I thought about my mother, who'd done exactly the same thing with Lilia. I thought about how the wisest people I'd had around me had never protected me by giving me the answers. They protected me by giving me the right questions at the right time. I left the building at 7:45 at night. The guard said good night to me with the same formal nod as in the morning. I walked to my car, started the engine, and before driving off, I sat for a moment in silence. I thought about everything that had happened in the last 72 hours. Ildefonso's news, my mother's instruction, Lilia's reaction, the first day, the meetings, Lazaro shaking my hand, the soulless message Lilia had sent at noon, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years with the clarity I felt that night. I felt that I was exactly where I needed to be. The following days had a different texture from any other week of my life. I got up early, arrived at the building with my head already working, and threw myself into the work with a concentration I didn't remember having in years. Not because I didn't care about what I did before, but because now the weight was different. Before I was someone who executed within a system others had built. Now I was the system. And that difference isn't small, it's huge. It's the difference between carrying a backpack and carrying someone on your shoulders. But in the midst of all that, Lilia was still there, not in a dramatic way, not with scenes or confrontations, but in the most silent and most revealing way possible, with her absence when it mattered and her presence when it didn't. After that message on the first Monday that I didn't answer, she sent another one on Wednesday. "Hey, it's weird you don't answer. Are you okay?" I read it, didn't answer. On Friday, she called me. I let it ring. She left me a voicemail I listened to that night, sitting on the couch with a glass of water in my hand and the TV off. Her voice sounded different, less natural, more calculated, like when someone rehearses what they're going to say before saying it. "Jeremias, you're worrying me now. Call me when you can." "Yes, I want to know how you're handling the work thing." The work thing, that's what she called it, as if it were something minor, as if 11 years of a career were simply the work thing. I called her on Saturday morning, not because I had anything to say to her, but because I wanted to hear her. I wanted to observe with the same clinical coldness with which one reviews an important document what was on the other side of that voice. She answered quickly. "Jeremias, finally I thought something had happened to you." "I'm fine," I told her. "Busy." "Busy with what? Are you looking for a job already?" There was the question that said it all without saying anything. Not, "How do you feel?" Not, "Do you want us to see each other?" But directly, "Are you looking for a job already?" As if my value in that conversation depended solely on my employment situation, as if the first thing she needed to know about me after days without speaking was if I was already moving toward the next income. "I'm sorting things out," I told her, without lying, without revealing anything. "Well," she answered, And in that word, there was a barely disguised impatience. It's just that you can't stay still for a long time either, right? These things have to be moved fast. I listened to her talk for several more minutes. She told me about a dinner she'd gone to with Georgina, about a trip she was planning with a friend for the next month, about a new apartment she'd seen and thought was interesting. At no point in that conversation did she ask me if I needed anything. At no point did she offer anything. At no point did her tone of voice have that specific texture the voice of someone who's truly worried about another person has. I hung up with a strange feeling. It wasn't anger, nor was it exactly sadness. It was something more like the calm resignation of someone who finally stops fighting against a truth that had been making itself evident for a long time. That afternoon, I went to see my mother. Carmina lives in the same house where she raised me. A small, tidy house with a garden she tends to with a dedication that has always seemed almost philosophical to me, as if keeping the plants alive were her way of showing that the things you take care of remain. She welcomed me at the door with a hug that lasted longer than usual, and without saying anything, she took me to the kitchen. She sat me in the same chair where I'd sat my whole life and put water on a boil. I told her everything, the work week, the meetings, Lazaro, Victor, and then I told her about Lilia, the messages, the Saturday call, the question about whether I was already looking for a job. My mother listened to me with her hands wrapped around the mug, looking at me with that attention that doesn't judge, but simply receives. When I finished, she stayed silent for a moment, then said, "And what do you feel?" "I feel like I'm seeing her for the first time," I answered. She nodded slowly. That's what happens when we stop looking at people the way we want them to be and start looking at them the way they are. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. "Why didn't you ever tell me anything before?" I asked her, not with reproach, with genuine curiosity, because it wouldn't have done any good. She said, "The things you hear before you're ready to hear them don't get in. They only build defenses. You had to see it yourself the moment you could see it without love covering your eyes." I kept thinking about that on the drive back home, about how many times in the last 3 years I'd seen small cracks and had filled them with explanations, with the benefit of the doubt, with that human tendency to build the most convenient narrative when the truth is uncomfortable. I remembered specific moments. A night when I got home late from the office after solving a crisis, and Lilia was upset, not because she cared about my well-being, but because we'd had plans and I'd canceled them. I remember a conversation about the future where she talked for 20 minutes about what she wanted and never once asked me what I wanted. I remembered the way she talked about my job, always in terms of what it produced, what it represented, what it allowed, never in terms of what it meant to me. The cracks had always been there. I'd simply chosen not to look at them. The following Monday, I arrived at the office and Margarita was waiting for me with an expression I immediately recognized as that of someone who has information they don't know if they should share. I asked her what was wrong. She hesitated a second. Then she told me she'd accidentally overheard a conversation Victor had with someone on the phone in the hallway that had mentioned my name, that he'd said something about how much longer someone without real management experience could last. I listened to it without my expression changing. I thanked Margarita for telling me and went on with my day, but I filed it away, with the same precision with which I filed important data at work. I kept that information in the place where I keep things it isn't time to use yet, but that at some point will matter. That week I closed the international contract that had been at a delicate point since my first day. I closed it on better terms than anyone expected. When the numbers reached the table, there was a moment of collective silence. One of those silences where people don't know yet whether to celebrate or verify that the data is correct. Then Margarita smiled, and Lazaro from the other side of the room looked at me with that expression I was already beginning to recognize as his version of praise, which wasn't effusive or loud, but simply honest. A look that said, "Yes, this is the man." I left that meeting and went to the bathroom. I washed my hands, looked at myself in the mirror, and thought about Lilia, who at that very moment was probably planning her trip with friends, not knowing that the man she'd silently discarded had just closed a 9-figure contract. I didn't feel satisfaction for that, or at least not in the small and bitter way someone feels it who needs the other person to know they won. What I felt was something cleaner, calmer, the satisfaction of someone who doesn't need anyone to see them to know what they're worth. That night, I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. "How was your week?" She asked me. "Good." I told her, "Very good." "And Lilia?" I paused. "I know what I have to do now." My mother didn't ask what it was. She just said, "Good." In that single word, there was everything I needed to hear. There's a huge difference between making a decision and executing it. Anyone can decide something in the privacy of their head, in the dark of a night where everything seems clear. The hard part is waking up the next day in the same light, as always, with the same phone in your hand, with the same 3-year history weighing on your chest, and doing what you decided to do, even if it hurts. I called Lilia on a Tuesday night. I didn't postpone it any longer. I didn't look for the perfect moment, because I knew the perfect moment doesn't exist for these things. There's only the moment when you're ready. And I was ready. She answered on the third ring. "Jeremias, how great. I was thinking about you." I didn't ask myself if it was true. It didn't matter anymore. "Lilia, we need to talk." There was a brief pause. One of those pauses people make when something in the tone of voice warns them that the conversation coming isn't the one they expected. "Sure, what's wrong?" I took a breath, not to gather courage, but to organize what I wanted to say, because I didn't want to say it with anger or pain, or with that accusing tone that turns a necessary conversation into an unnecessary fight. I wanted to say it clearly, with the same clarity with which I'd started to see everything in the last few weeks. I think we both know something changed, and I think neither of us has been completely honest about what that something is. I'm going to do it now. Silence. When I called you to tell you I've been fired, what I needed to hear was your voice. Not solutions, not advice, not plans, just your voice telling me you were there. And what I heard was something else. What I heard told me more about us than 3 years of conversations have been able to tell me. "Jeremias, that's not fair." I was at Georgina's house, and I'm not blaming you. I interrupted her calmly. "I'm explaining to you what I saw. And what I saw is that the moment the picture changed, your reaction wasn't that of someone who loves me. It was that of someone who was evaluating the situation." Another longer silence. And in that silence, there was no immediate denial. There was no impulse of someone who's falsely accused and needs to defend themselves right away. There was a stillness that confirmed everything without the need for words. "Lilia, I'm not calling to fight. I'm calling because I think we both deserve honesty. And the truth is I spent so much time looking forward that I didn't stop to take a good look at what I had right next to me. That's also my responsibility." "What are you saying exactly?" she asked. Her voice had changed. Now it was more careful, more measured. "That I think this has nowhere to grow, and that I prefer to acknowledge it now respectfully than to keep going building something on a foundation neither of us is really convinced of supporting." There was a very long pause, so long that for a moment I thought she'd hung up. "Is there someone else?" she finally asked. The question surprised me, not because of what it implied, but because it revealed the logic from which she processed things. Her first hypothesis in the face of a breakup was another person, not a real incompatibility, not a genuine drifting apart. Another person, as if the only valid reason to leave a relationship were that you already have a replacement ready. I didn't answer her. It's just me, seeing clearly what I didn't want to see before. We hung up without drama, without slamming doors, without the phrases people say when they want the other person to be left with a specific wound. It was an adult conversation, clean as far as these things can be clean, and when I put the phone on the table, I felt something I didn't expect to feel. Relief. Not the superficial relief of someone who finishes something that bothered them, but the deep relief of someone who finally stops carrying something that wasn't theirs to carry. I've been holding up for 3 years a version of that relationship that existed more in my head than in reality. And letting go of it wasn't losing something, it was getting space back. Space for me, for what mattered, for the work I had ahead, and that demanded everything I had to give. That week at the office was intense in a different way from the previous ones. The first few weeks had been about settling in, about proving I deserve the place. This week was about something more complex, an internal restructuring that Ildefonso had left pending and that nobody had wanted to touch because it involved difficult decisions about people, about roles, about the kind of conversations people avoid because they're uncomfortable and necessary at the same time. I met with each department head separately. I listened, took notes, asked questions that made people uncomfortable, not to make them uncomfortable, but to get to where comfortable answers couldn't reach. And at the end of that round of conversations, I had a clear picture of where the real problem was and where the people who could be part of the solution were. Victor was part of the problem, not in an obvious way, not in the clumsy way of someone who openly sabotages, but in that sophisticated and much more dangerous way of someone who creates narratives, who talks in the hallways just enough to plant doubts without ever committing to a concrete statement, who positions himself near those with influence and strategically distances himself from those in difficulty. I'd seen that pattern before in 11 years observing how an organization really works on the inside, and I knew exactly what it was. One day, I called him to my office, closed the door, invited him to sit, and without beating around the bush, without the kind of runaround people use when they want to seem diplomatic, I told him, "Victor, I know what you're doing. I'm not going to spell out for you because we both know what I'm talking about. I'm going to tell you one thing. This company needs people who build, not people who erode. You have the talent to do the former. The decision of what you're going to do is yours." He stayed very still. That specific stillness of someone who didn't expect to be called out so directly and is calculating in real time how to respond. Finally, he said, "Understood." 2 words, without admitting anything, without denying it either. Good, I told him that's all. He left my office, and I closed the mental file I had on that conversation. I'd said it, he'd heard it. What he did with that was his decision. I didn't have the time or energy to manage someone else's ambition. I had a company to run. That afternoon, Margarita brought me a coffee without me asking. She put it on the desk with that usual discretion of hers. And when she turned to leave, I asked her, "Margarita, how many years have you been at this company?" She stopped. 17, she said, "and you never wanted to leave." She thought for a moment. "Sometimes, but there was always someone here who was worth it. First, Mr. Ildefonso." She paused. "Now you." She left before I could answer. I stared at the cup of coffee. I thought about my mother, who'd spent her whole life being exactly the kind of person for me. The one who's worth it, the one who stays not for what you have, but for who you are. And I thought about Lilia, who'd been the complete opposite without me wanting to see it. That night, I drove home in silence, without music, without calls, just the noise of the city outside and me inside, thinking that sometimes losing something you thought was yours is the only way to discover what you really have. And what I had for the first time in a long time was total clarity. There's a version of yourself that only appears when the pressure is high enough. It isn't the version you show in interviews or the one you describe when they ask what you're like. It's the version that emerges when there are no comfortable options, when the easy path no longer exists, when the only possible direction is forward, even if forward is scary. I met that version of myself in the 2 months that followed everything that had happened. And what I found surprised me, not because it was extraordinary, but because it had always been there and I hadn't seen it clearly enough. The most important project of that quarter was an expansion into 2 new markets. Ildefonso had left it in the analysis stage with folders full of data and a pending decision nobody had wanted to make because it involved real, measurable risk. If it worked, the company would grow in a way that would change its position in the sector. If it failed, the consequences were serious. The kind of decision that defines careers, the kind of decision people avoid when they can and face when they have no other choice. I faced it head on. I spent 3 weeks reviewing every number, every projection, every variable the teams had documented. I met with analysts, with market teams, with external advisors Ildefonso had consulted before. I asked questions that sometimes caused discomfort because they went beyond what was in the documents and reached the assumptions nobody had questioned out loud. And at the end of those 3 weeks, I had a complete picture, not perfect. No decision of that size has a perfect picture, but clear enough to act. I convened the board of directors on a Thursday morning. There were 8 people in that room, all with more years in the sector than me, all with the kind of accumulated experience that generates strong opinions and natural resistance to change. I presented my analysis, presented the risks without minimizing them, because one of the things I learned in 11 years is that people don't trust someone who tells them everything is going to be fine, but someone who tells them exactly what can go wrong and why the risk is worth it anyway. I presented the decision I recommended making. There was intense debate. Lazaro asked 3 questions that were actually 3 tests, and I answered them all with concrete data. One of the board members, a white-haired man who'd seen 4 previous CEOs pass through that company, looked at me during almost the whole presentation with an expression I didn't try to decipher because it would have distracted me. At the end of the debate, when I called for the vote, the result was 6 in favor, 2 abstentions. Approved. I left that room with something in my chest that wasn't euphoria, but something more sustained and deeper. It was the specific feeling of having been exactly up to what the situation demanded. No more, no less. Exactly. Right there, Margarita was waiting for me outside with an expression that for the first time since I'd met her wasn't a containment, but of something that looked a lot like genuine emotion. Congratulations, CEO. I thanked her and kept walking because there was work to do. That week, without me looking for it, something began to change in the way people interacted with me inside the company. It wasn't flattery, which is easy to spot and dismiss. It was something more subtle and more valuable. It was the kind of respect built on facts that doesn't need to be declared because it's simply there, visible in the way people walk into your office, and how they present their problems, and whether they come with excuses or solutions. Lazaro started staying a few minutes after meetings to chat, not about work exclusively, about the company, about its history, about past decisions that had shaped the culture I'd inherited. It was his way of passing something on to me that wasn't in any folder or report. It was institutional memory, and I received it with the same attention I'd received everything Ildefonso had taught me for years. Victor, for his part, had changed, not dramatically, but it was visible to anyone who knew how to observe. He came to meetings more prepared, talked less in the hallways, contributed more in formal spaces. I don't know if it was the conversation we'd had in my office or if it was simply that the new environment didn't leave him room for his previous behavior. I didn't care much about the reason either. What mattered was the result. One Friday afternoon, when most had already left, I stayed alone in the office reviewing projections for the next quarter. The city outside was lighting up with the nightlights, and I was there in silence, with a cold coffee I'd forgotten to drink and a concentration that didn't feel like an effort, but like something natural, like water, finding its level. The phone rang. It was Mario, a businessman with whom the company had a historic relationship, someone Ildefonso had met decades ago, and who represented the kind of bond that isn't built with a contract, but with time and accumulated trust. He was calling to congratulate me on the expansion decision, which he'd already heard about through his own channels. But what he told me at the end of that call was what stayed with me. Jeremias, Ildefonso told me about you years ago. He told me he was training someone who'd eventually surpass him. At the time, I thought it was generosity on his part. Now I think it was accuracy. I hung up slowly, stared at the phone on the desk, and thought about Ildefonso, who for 11 years had been doing something I hadn't completely understood until that moment. He hadn't been using me. He'd been shaping me with every difficult project he'd assigned me, with every crisis he'd let me solve alone, with every moment he'd stayed quiet when he could have intervened. He was building something, not a tool, a person. I thought about my mother who'd done exactly the same my whole life, who'd never solved my problems, but had always been there when the results arrived, who'd waited for the exact moment to ask the question that changes everything, who'd trusted I was capable of seeing what I needed to see if she gave me the right conditions to see it. I realized something that night, alone in that office with the city shining outside. I realized that the people who'd shaped me the most had never protected me from difficulties. They prepared me for them. And there's a huge difference between those two things. Protection creates dependency. Preparation creates strength. And strength, real strength, not the one you declare, but the one that emerges when there's no other option. That's the only thing nobody can take away from you. That same week, I got a message from Georgina, Lilia's friend she'd been with the night. I called to tell her about the job. It was a short message, almost clumsy in its bluntness, saying, Jeremias, I know it's none of my business, but I want you to know Lilia is seeing someone. I didn't want you to find out somewhere else. I read it once, closed it, and went back to what I was doing, not because it didn't affect me, but because what I felt in that moment wasn't the sharp pain of betrayal, but something more like the confirmation of something I already knew. Lilia had moved on. That was exactly what had to happen. People who are with you for what you represent don't wait when what you represent disappears, even if it's temporarily, even if it's a lie. They look for the next place to stand. And that isn't cruelty, it's simply what they are. What mattered to me was no longer Lilia. What mattered to me was the company, the work, the people who depended on the decisions I made every day. What mattered to me was continuing to be the man I'd become in those weeks. Not the man I'd been before, who was good but incomplete, but this one, the one who sees clearly, the one who doesn't need anyone to hold him up to stay on his feet, the one who knows the difference between people who are just around and people who stay. That night, I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. "How are you?" she asked me. I thought for a moment before answering. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to say it exactly right. "I'm fine, Mom. I'm really fine." There was a brief silence, and then her voice with that specific warmth only people who have known you since before you knew yourself have. "I know, son, I know. There's one thing nobody tells you about building something true. They tell you it's hard. They tell you it requires sacrifice. They tell you there are moments when you'll want to drop everything and take the shortest path. But what nobody tells you is that at some point, if you keep going with enough honesty, the work stops feeling like an effort and starts feeling like an identity, as if it isn't something you do anymore, but something you are. And when you reach that point, something changes inside in a way that can't be reversed. I reached that point 3 months after taking over as CEO. The expansion the board had approved was moving forward, not without complications, because nothing that size moves forward without complications, but with the solidity of something built on real analysis and not on empty optimism. The first results from a new market arrived on a Wednesday morning in the form of a report Margarita left on my desk without saying anything, just with a small pencil mark in the margin of the most important number. I looked at her, nodded, and told her good eye. She smiled and left. The numbers were better than projected. Not spectacularly, not the kind that sparks loud celebrations, but the kind that silently confirms the decision was right. And that silent confirmation was worth more than any applause. That week also brought something I didn't expect, a call from Mario, the businessman who'd congratulated me weeks ago, proposing a meeting to explore a strategic alliance between his company and ours. It was the kind of conversation that before, as an employee, I would have prepared for someone else to lead. Now I was the one who would lead it. I met with him on a Thursday in his office. A man of calm presence and precise words who spoke like someone who has learned that time is too valuable to waste beating around the bush. We were there for 2 hours, and at the end Mario looked at me with that expression people have when they've decided something and are just confirming their decision was right. "You have something very few CEOs have, Jeremias." I asked him what it was. "You truly listen. You don't listen to answer, you listen to understand. That's rarer than it seems." I left that meeting with more than a potential alliance. I left with the confirmation that the man I was being in that office, in those meetings, in those difficult decisions made with incomplete information and complete responsibility, was the man I'd always wanted to be. Not the man Lilia had known, not the efficient and self-sacrificing employee of 11 years. This one, the one who makes decisions, the one who supports others, the one who builds. It was that same week I started hearing things about Lilia I didn't look for, but that arrived anyway, the way news you didn't ask for always arrives, but the world delivers anyway. Georgina wrote to me again, this time with more detail. She told me Lilia was dating Victor. I stood with the phone in my hand reading that message twice, not because it was hard to understand, but because I needed a moment to process what I felt reading it. And what I felt was a combination of things I didn't expect. There was some surprise, although deep down it wasn't a real surprise. There was something like sadness, not for Lilia, but for the version of myself that had believed for 3 years that that relationship was something worth protecting. And there was beneath all that something that took me a while to identify, but when I found it, it was crystal clear. It was understanding. Not the generous understanding of someone who forgives, but the cold and clean understanding of someone who finally understands the whole mechanism. Lilia hadn't waited. Lilia had never thought about waiting. From the moment I told her I'd been fired, even if it was a lie, she'd started evaluating options. And Victor, who'd been moving for weeks in ways I'd observed, but hadn't completely connected, had been the option she found. Everything fit with a precision that was almost admirable in its internal logic. Victor knew I was the new CEO. He'd been in the same meetings, had seen the same results, knew exactly what my position was and what I represented. And yet he'd chosen Lilia, which meant Victor didn't know Lilia and I had broken up because I told her I got fired, which meant Victor thought he was moving on a board where I was the loser. I put the phone away, closed my eyes for a second and smiled, not with malice, but with that specific smile of someone who sees the whole board when the others only see their own pieces. I let it be. I didn't do anything. I didn't say anything. I went on with my work, with my meetings, with the decisions that mattered, with the life I was building with each passing day. But time, which is the fairest referee there is, was already doing its job. 3 weeks later, in an expanded management meeting, where representatives from several companies in the sector were present, including Mario's company, Victor made the mistake I'd been waiting for without knowing I was waiting. He presented a proposal he developed without consulting his team, without aligning with the strategy we defined, and with numbers that didn't hold up to the analysis of someone who knew how to look. He presented it with his usual confidence, that confidence that works perfectly when nobody is looking closely, but that breaks the moment someone asks the right question. Lazaro asked the right question. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't humiliating. He was simply precise. He pointed out an inconsistency in the numbers with the calm of someone who has 19 years of experience and doesn't need to raise his voice for his observation to weigh like a ton. Victor tried to answer. He couldn't. He tried again. He couldn't either. And in that room, in front of people who had spent decades evaluating executives, Victor was exposed in the only way that matters at that level, intellectually. I didn't say anything during that moment. I didn't intervene. I didn't rescue him or sink him further. I simply observed with the same attention I'd observed everything in those months and made a mental note of what I was seeing. After the meeting, Mario approached me in the hallway. He spoke to me in a low voice, with that way of his of saying important things as if they were casual observations. Your team has an alignment problem. That man presented something that contradicts everything you approved last month. I told him I knew, and I told him it was already being handled. Mario nodded, said good, and left. That afternoon, I called Victor to my office for the second time. This time the conversation was different from the first. The first time I'd given him a warning. This time I was giving him a consequence. I explained with my usual calm that what had happened in that meeting wasn't acceptable at the level we were operating at, that the company couldn't afford to have someone in his position present unaligned work in front of strategic partners, that he would have to take on a different role within the organization with less external visibility and more internal supervision, while he rebuilt the trust he damaged that morning. Victor looked at me for a moment that felt longer than it was, and in his eyes there was something I hadn't seen before. It wasn't the calculated stillness of previous times. It was something more like the belated understanding of someone who finally realizes what board they've been playing on and discovers they lost a long time ago without knowing it. Understood. He said the same 2 words as always, but this time they sounded different. He left. I closed the door and sat in silence for a moment, looking at the city through the large window. I thought about everything that had happened since that Tuesday in the waiting room. I thought about Ildefonso telling me to watch him. I thought about my mother telling me to call Lilia. I thought about Lilia hanging up with 3 cold words. I thought about Lazaro shaking my hand the first day. I thought about Mario telling me I truly listened. I thought about Victor believing he was playing on a board that I'd actually been seeing in full from the beginning. And I thought that life, when you make the right decisions, even if they hurt, has a way of sorting itself out, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, with the patience of someone who knows that true things aren't built fast, but they don't collapse easily either. I called my mother that night. She answered on the second ring. "Mom, Remember you told me Lilia was going to be her loss, not mine? I remember. You were right. There was a brief, warm silence, the kind that doesn't need words to say everything. I always was, son, she said. I always was. There are encounters you plan and encounters that simply happen. The first almost never turn out the way you imagine. The second, the ones that arrive without warning, without preparation, without the script you would have written if you'd had time, those are the ones that reveal who you really are. Not who you want to be, not who you try to show, but who you are when you don't have time to choose how to appear. The event was an annual industry dinner, the kind of event attended by executives, strategic partners, businessmen with history, people who have spent decades building relationships in a world where relationships are as important as or more important than contracts. Ildefonso had attended for 20 consecutive years. That year, for the first time, the one representing the company would be me. Margarita reminded me 2 weeks in advance. She told me it was an important event, that our presence there carried a symbolic weight, as well as a practical one, that the people in that room were exactly the kind of people with whom we needed to keep building trust. I knew it. I prepared myself with the same attention I prepared for everything in those months. I reviewed who would be present, what companies they'd represent, what conversations were worth having, and with whom. In none of those preparations did I think of Lilia, not because I'd forcefully erased her from my mind, but because she had genuinely stopped taking up the space she used to take up. That's how time works when you fill it with things that matter. It doesn't erase, it only displaces. And what had displaced Lilia in my head was so concrete, so real, so full of meaning, that the space she'd occupied now seemed almost impossibly small. I arrived at the event on a Tuesday night. The room was large, elegant, without being ostentatious, with that specific atmosphere of places where important people gather without needing to prove it. Mario greeted me near the entrance with that handshake of his that communicated more than many conversations. He introduced me to 3 people in the first 10 minutes. Each introduction made with the kind of introduction that builds context instead of just giving names. This is Jeremias, the new CEO, the one who made the expansion decision everyone was waiting for someone to make. That phrase said with the naturalness of someone who isn't doing a favor, but simply describing a reality, was worth more than any business card. I spent the first hour moving around with that mix of attention and calm I'd learned to cultivate, listening more than talking, asking questions that generated real conversations instead of empty information exchanges. I'd learned in those months that the most interesting people in any room aren't the ones who talk the most, but the ones who make others want to talk. And I wanted to be that person, not out of strategy, but because I was genuinely interested in what people had to say when they felt truly heard. It was during dinner that I saw them. I didn't look for them. There was no reason for me to have looked for them. I was sitting at my table deep in conversation with a businessman from Monterey and with Lazaro, who'd come as part of the company's representation when I saw them walk in. Lilia and Victor together. He with that outward confidence I already knew was more surface than substance. She in an elegant dress and that way of hers of walking into a place as if she were evaluating whether the place deserved her presence. I felt something. It would be dishonest to say I felt nothing. I felt that brief and involuntary instant of recognition, that second where the body reacts before the mind can intervene. But it passed quickly, much faster than it would have passed months ago. And what remained after that instant wasn't pain or anger or any of the things you expect to feel when you see the person you thought you'd build a future with walking in on someone else's arm. What remained was a calm that surprised me with its depth. Lazaro, who was sitting next to me, saw them too. He looked at me for a second. I continued the conversation with the businessman from Monterey without losing the thread, without changing the tone, without giving that moment more weight than it deserved. Lazaro nodded imperceptibly and went back to his glass of water. We didn't need to say anything. It was one of those silent understandings that only exist between people who have earned each other's trust. I saw them settle at a table across the room. Victor greeted people with that usual energy of his. That energy that works perfectly on the surface, but doesn't have enough depth to hold up when someone looks closely. Lilia smiled. It was the same smile as always, that smile I'd interpreted for 3 years as warmth and now recognized as what it was, a perfectly calibrated social tool. The moment they saw me was about 40 minutes later, during the space between dinner and dessert, when people get up to mingle and the room takes on that fluid movement of conversations forming and dissolving. I was standing with Mario and the president of an associated company when I saw in my peripheral vision that Victor had spotted me. I saw him recalibrate. I saw the exact moment he processed what he was seeing. Not the Jeremias Lilia had described to him, not the man who'd lost his job, but me standing in the center of a conversation with Mario, being introduced to the president of an associated company at the most important event in the sector, representing the company that had supposedly fired me. I saw all that flash across his face in less than 3 seconds, and I did nothing about it. I continued my conversation. I continued listening. I continued being exactly who I was before he saw me, because that's what it means to have reached a real place, that your state doesn't depend on who's looking at you. It was Lilia who approached first. Alone. Victor had stayed at his table with a glass in his hand and an expression I didn't analyze because it wasn't my job to analyze it. Lilia walked toward me with that confidence of hers that now seemed different to me, not lesser, but simply visible in its internal mechanism in a way it wasn't before. Jeremias. Lilia. I answered her with the same tone I would have greeted any acquaintance in that room. Natural, without calculated coldness or forced warmth, simply normal. I didn't know you'd be here, she said. I'm representing the company. I answered her, without further explanations, without the context she clearly needed, but that I had no obligation to give her. I watched her process that. I saw the moment the pieces started moving in her head. The company, the event. Mario greeting me from afar with a nod. Lazaro a few feet away. The entire context of that room, telling her something she still couldn't fully articulate. How have you been? She asked. And in that question, there was something there hadn't been in any of the conversations we had during the weeks after the supposed news of the firing. There was real interest or something very close to it. Very well, I told her. And you? Good too. A pause. Jeremias, Lilia. I interrupted her softly, without bluntness. I'm glad you're well. I really am. I held her gaze for a second. Take care. And I turned around, not to hurt her, not to prove anything, but because there genuinely wasn't anything else to say. Because the conversation she wanted to have in that moment was a conversation I'd had with myself months ago in the dark of a kitchen at 3 a.m, and it was already closed. Not with bitterness, with completeness. I returned to my conversation with Mario, who welcomed me back with that usual naturalness of his, without asking, without commenting, without making that moment a bigger deal than it was. That was also a form of respect, the most sophisticated kind. That night, driving back home, I drove in silence for a while. I thought about how differently I'd imagined that reunion months ago, in weak moments where the mind builds scenes that never happen exactly as you think them. I'd imagined versions where I said perfect things, where she understood everything at once, where there was some kind of dramatic recognition of what had happened. None of that happened, and it was infinitely better that way, because what happened instead was something no scene built in the mind can beat. The truth happened, simple, without ornaments, without speeches. Two people who'd been part of each other's life, seeing each other in a room, and each being exactly who they were, without masks, without acting, just reality. In reality, that night favored me in a way that didn't need anyone else to name it for it to be completely true. I called my mother when I got home. She answered on the second ring. How was the event? She asked. Good, I told her. I saw them. A brief silence, and nothing, Mom. That's the best part. Absolutely nothing. I heard her calm breathing on the other end, and then with that voice of hers that carries decades of wisdom in every syllable, that son is called having one. There's a question I asked myself many times during those months. Not out loud. Not in conversations with my mother, or with Ildefonso, or with anyone. Just in those moments of real silence you have when the city sleeps and the mind finally stops processing the urgent and starts processing the true. The question was simple. It was this. What is left of a person when you take away everything they have? Not the job, not the salary, not the title, or the 34th floor, or the large window overlooking the city, but everything. The love they thought they had, the version of themselves they'd built over 11 years, the certainty that the close people were close for the right reasons. What is left when all that crumbles at the same time? I lived a version of that question, not the most extreme version. I'm not going to exaggerate what it was to give it more drama than it needs, but a real enough version for the question to stop being abstract and become something I could touch. And what I discovered in the months that followed everything that had happened was this. What's left is what was always there, what no external circumstance can build or destroy because it doesn't live on the outside, but on the inside. Character, clarity, the ability to look at a difficult situation without turning away from it, the decision made over and over again in silence, to keep being who you are even if the context changes. That remains, and it turns out it's enough, more than enough. The months that followed the event were the most intense and most complete of my professional life. The expansion I'd approved started generating results that exceeded the original projections with a consistency that wasn't luck, but the direct consequence of well-made decisions. Mario and I formalized the strategic alliance we'd been building, an alliance that opened doors the company hadn't had access to before. Lazaro, who'd started as a test I needed to pass, became something I didn't expect, a real ally, the kind that isn't declared in speeches, but is shown in the moments where it matters. And Victor was what time puts in its place when you have the patience not to intervene. I didn't fire him. It wasn't necessary. What I did was exactly what I told him in our second conversation. I relocated him to a role with less visibility and more supervision. And what happened in the following weeks was something I'd seen before in other people and recognized immediately. Victor wasn't made for spaces where there's no audience. He wasn't built for quiet work, for the effort nobody applauds, for the consistency that generates no immediate recognition. Without the stage, without the ability to mingle among influential people, without the context that allowed him to be what he was, Victor gradually faded until one day, an ordinary Monday, Margarita informed me he'd submitted his resignation. I let him go without drama, without unnecessary conversations, without the kind of exit that turns a departure into an event. I signed the documents, wished him the best through Margarita, and went on with my day because that's also a form of power, not needing things to be big for them to be real. What happened with Lilia in the following months reached me the same way everything having to do with her had reached me, without me looking for it, through people who thought they were doing me a favor by telling me. Georgina wrote to me one more time with that slightly clumsy honesty of hers that deep down I appreciated, because at least it was genuine. She told me Lilia and Victor had broken up, that it had been messy, that Lilia was going through a hard time. I read the message, closed it, and didn't answer, not because I rejoiced in her hardship. That would be too small for what I felt at that point, but because genuinely there wasn't anything I could or wanted to add to that situation. Lilia was a person who'd made her decisions with the information she had and the value she had. The consequences of those decisions were hers, not mine. And my energy, everything I had to give, belonged to other places. One Saturday morning, I went to see my mother. I brought sweetbread, which is one of those small customs you keep not out of habit, but because it represents something bigger than itself. I sat in the same chair as always, in that kitchen that smells the same since I can remember, and we sat for a while in silence before speaking. Not the awkward silence of someone who doesn't know what to say, the comfortable silence of two people who know each other well enough not to need to fill every moment with words. "How are you, son?" Really, I thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. Not the automatic version of being fine, the real version. "I'm at peace," I told her. I don't remember the last time I said that and meant it. Carmina looked at me with that expression of hers. I've spent my whole life trying to decipher and never completely decipher. There's something in her gaze that mixes pride with tenderness and with something harder to name, something like the relief of someone who spent years waiting for someone to arrive at a place and finally sees them arrive. "You always knew how to arrive," she told me. "You just needed some things to get out of the way." You knew Lilia was like that from the beginning. She didn't hesitate. I saw signs from the first time I met her, but it wasn't my place to say it. When you tell someone the person they love doesn't deserve them, all you achieve is making that person defend the one who doesn't deserve it and pull away from the one who does. It had to be your moment to see it. And if that moment had never come, I looked at her calmly. It would have come. Things that aren't true don't hold up forever. They only hold up until you stop making the effort to hold them up. I kept thinking about that for a long time after that conversation, about how much energy I'd invested unknowingly in holding up a version of that relationship that required constant effort to stay standing, and about how different it felt now when the only thing I was holding up was what was real, the work, the relationship with my mother, the genuine connections I'd built in those months with people like Lazaro and Mario, the relationship with myself, which is the hardest of all and the only one that determines the quality of all the rest. Ildefonso called me one Sunday. He called me occasionally, not to supervise, but to chat with that freedom people who no longer have anything to prove or lose have. He asked me how everything was going. I told him the numbers, the alliance with Mario, Victor's departure. He listened closely, and when I finished, he said something I won't forget. Jeremias, when I chose you for that role, there were people who asked me if I was sure. They told me you were good, but that you were missing something, that you were missing having lost something important. He paused. I told him that's exactly why I chose you, because whoever has never lost anything doesn't know the true weight of what they build. And whoever knows the weight of what they build doesn't let go of it easily. I hung up that call and sat in silence for several minutes. I thought about everything that had happened since that Tuesday in the waiting room. I thought about my mother's voice telling me to call Lilia. I thought about Lilia's silence after 3 cold words. I thought about Lazaro shaking my hand, about Mario telling me I truly listened, about Margarita putting coffee on my desk without me asking, about Victor learning the hard way the difference between seeming and being, about Lilia somewhere in that city navigating the consequences of decisions made from a place that wasn't love. And I thought about myself, about the man I was now, compared to the one who'd walked into that waiting room on a Tuesday morning with his hands clasped over his knees and his stomach tight. They were the same man in essence, same name, same history, same 11 years of accumulated work. But something had changed that didn't have an exact name. It was as if everything that had happened had functioned like a pressure that doesn't destroy, but consolidates, that doesn't break, but defines, that doesn't subtract, but in the most paradoxical way possible, adds. The last time I spoke with my mother before writing all this, she told me something I want to close with here, because I think it's the most important truth of everything I lived. I asked her what would have happened if Lilia had reacted differently that night. If she'd cried, if she'd said she was staying by my side no matter what, if she'd passed the test my mother had designed without knowing it was a test. Carmina thought for a moment, then said, then she would have been the right woman, and I would have been the first to tell you. And if I'd been wrong, and if all this had been a misunderstanding, it wasn't a misunderstanding, Jeremias. But if it had been, you would have had in front of you a woman who chose you in the worst imaginable moment. What's wrong with knowing that? There was nothing wrong, absolutely nothing. I got up from that chair, the same chair my whole life. I hugged her for a moment, I didn't want to rush, and went out into the morning with that specific feeling you only get on days when you're exactly where you're meant to be, being exactly who you're meant to be, with enough clarity to recognize it. I didn't need anything else. I didn't need Lilia to know what she'd lost. I didn't need Victor to understand what board he'd played on. I didn't need anyone to validate what I already knew with complete certainty. Because there are victories that aren't celebrated out loud, that aren't published or proclaimed or proven, that are simply lived in silence, with the deep satisfaction of someone who built something real on a foundation that no external circumstance can move. That's the victory I was left with, and it's the only one I ever wanted to have.